This talk is obviously about job planning. It's going to take a little while. There's a lot to cover. Job planning is probably one of the most important things that happens to consultants, and it influences a lot of your quality of life, what you can do as a consultant, the joy of your job, and just how beneficial you are to patients. It's a really critical thing, and it's something that's poorly understood often by both consultants themselves and their clinical managers. So I think it's well worth exploring fully. The end result of that is it's going to be a long talk. It's about 45 minutes, maybe even 50 minutes. I'm going to go relatively slowly because there's some concepts in here which people won't be aware of, and therefore I just think it's worth taking the time to really get it across so that you can appreciate some of the subtleties involved in job planning. My name, as you know, probably is Mike Henley, and I'm Deputy Chair of Consultants Committee, and I'm Chair of the Pay, Terms and Conditions Subcommittee, and I'm going to take you through this talk. There are lots and lots of avenues we're going to look at during this, hence the duration. But I think it's first of all important to think about some of the underlying principles behind this. I would really urge all of you to take the time to go up into your study and look in the drawer and dig out your original contract. You will have been given a contract. It is only probably 5, 6, at most 7 pages long. It's well worth reading. It will tell you what your entitlement to SPAs is, etc. There is a national template contract. Everybody should traditionally have the national contract. Have to say that some trusts, the trusts where they feel that you are lucky to be working for us at all, those trusts may have given you a non-standard contract. If you discover that's the case, you just search for the template contract nationally. It'll be on NHS Employers website. If you've got a non-standard contract, I suggest that you get in touch with your LNC, you start to discuss it with other people on non-standard contracts, and you decide whether you want to have a standard contract, because that is within your power if you're willing to all take action over it. I think it's iniquitous that some people have got a decent contract and some people have got a fast and loose contract. Anyway, look up your contract, really important. Also, worth looking at your terms and conditions of service. It's a massive document, but actually the relevant bits on job planning, etc., are really quite short. That's what the QR code's for. If you click on the QR code, it'll take you to the National Terms and Conditions of Service. These things have been present since 2003. They're not new, but again, they're poorly understood. You will have local policy, so you'll need to look up at your trust what's on your intranet to see what your local policy is. Policies are agreed between local negotiating committees and trusts. Over the years, the terms and conditions are overlaid by these policies, and that's a matter for the LNC. If you don't like what you read, take it up with the LNC, join the LNC. We're always looking for people to join LNCs, and if you're really passionate, become the LNC chair. Important. This also interacts with the BMA Consultants Charter. Search for it on Google, BMA Consultants Charter. It takes up a lot of the quality issues, and it's grading trusts against what they provide for consultants, and that's just been rolled out a couple of days ago, so I would really urge you to look it up. Throughout the talk, I'm going to concentrate on NHS consultants, but obviously for academics, the following principles apply. And a word of warning, if you get out there and look up NHS England guidance, there's a push on at the moment, ignition events to revamp job planning. There's quite a lot of it we do agree with. We certainly agree that job planning should be a tool to enable doctors to work efficiently, but there's plenty that in terms of NHS England documentation that we don't agree with. So just always bear that in mind. It's not all agreed with the BMA, that's absolutely for sure. Important that's understood. What on earth is job planning for? Well, if you ask consultants, as we did in our national survey recently, 61% of respondents said that job planning is primarily a tool to drive down costs. I think many of us feel like that. That's not really what it's supposed to be about. That wasn't what it was invented for in 2003. Basically to ensure that we're all rowing in the same direction, which is clearly a sensible thing in the complex organisations that we work in. What's also vital is that as a consultant, you are given the tools that you need to actually do your job. And that may be a PA, it may be awards, access to clinics, access to theatres, etc. That is also within the job plan, which we will cover later. Your career is going to change as you go through. You could maybe be appointed age 30 or 32 or 35, 36 as a surgeon. You're still potentially going to be there age 67. I've got colleagues actually at 71 who are still seemingly loving the job. So you're going to be there for a long while. It's important that your actual job, your job plan changes as you go through. And some of the elements, such as SPAs, etc., are essential for the survivability of the job. You simply will not be able to do it if you're doing a job which is all clinical work. Seems unlikely you're not going to get burnout. The actual process of job planning is supposed to be a partnership approach. Both sides should be approaching it looking for agreement in reality. That's not to say you have to agree, but it should be in partnership. Theoretically, a draft's prepared by your lead clinician. There should be an annual review if you're already in post, and you'll look at agreeing a bunch of PAs, programmed activities, which we'll cover in a second, the categories of that, all of your objectives and all the things you need. A full-time consultant is paid 10 programmed activities. Each one of those is going to be a different duration depending on whether it's in standard time, where it'll be 4 hours, or premium time, 3 hours, and we'll come to that in due course. I would say to everybody, it's vital that if you're on more than 10, that you and your job planner identify which are the additional programmed activities. Really important, which are the extras, so that if you want to go back down to 10, both parties know which ones are going to be the ones which are going to be stopped. Because if you're doing more than 10, you only need to give 3 months' notice to say you're going to stop. If, however, both parties disagree with what those are, you're going to end up in a world of haggling, and that's not a good place to be. Make sure it's agreed up front. The broad categories are these: direct clinical care, anything to do with the named patient, supporting professional activities, additional NHS responsibilities, external duties, and private professional services. And we're going to go through these a bit one at a time. DCC, down the left column, as I say, anything to do with patients. Supporting professional activities, down the right. Training, medical education, CPD, your own personal CPD outside of study leave, formal teaching, audit, job planning, appraisal, research, clinical governance, and all of those management emails, which we know there are lots and lots and lots of. One of the big bones of contention is, of course, SPAs. Obviously, we all understand that. And there is a new concept, or not a new concept, a concept from 2010 of core SPAs. Let me first point out there is absolutely nothing in the national contract or terms and conditions of service about core SPAs. They simply do not exist. The Academy of the Royal College has published a document on it. It's a T's and C's thing. I think really they shouldn't have done, but they did. And that's where this concept of core SPAs has come from, and it sort of subdivided things up. You will hear about it a lot. Your trusts will be trying to stick absolutely everything into core SPAs. I think the best thing is to just stick to typically 2.5, but if you're in a world of core SPAs, it may be difficult to unpick that rapidly. But let's go through the background. So this is from the document. You can search for the document. Just search for Advice on Supporting Professional Activities in Consultant Job Planning, Academy of Medical Royal Colleges. You'll find the document on the web. Here's a paragraph from it. At present, before the introduction of medical revalidation, those colleges that have estimated the minimum time required, and this is important, solely for consultants to keep up to date, have suggested 1 SPA or 1.5 SPAs. This does not include the agreed annual study leave allowance. Okay, so that's just for keeping up to date. However, the next paragraph, which trusts seemingly have never read, is this important one, which says, however, a contract that includes only 1.5 SPAs and 8.5 programmed activities would have no time at all for other SPA work, such as teaching, training, research, service development, clinical governance, contribution to management, etc. It is unthinkable that a consultant could be employed with absolutely no involvement in management if only attendance at departmental meetings, reading and responding to messages from management, etc. Similarly, It is difficult to envisage a post that never involves any teaching or training of any sort. Most NHS employers receive funding for undergraduate and postgraduate teaching, and in brackets I would say that is a lot of money and should be explained how this is used. A post that does not permit any involvement in service development or clinical governance would be contrary to our concept of the consultant role. From this it follows that 1.5 SPAs in total would be inadequate, and that the original recommendation in the consultant contract is not a recommendation as such, of 2.5 SPAs as typical seems reasonable. That's pretty clear, isn't it? In addition, if you're a more recent appointee than somebody a bit more long in the tooth, such as myself, they have words for you too. We've noticed a trend for newly appointed consultants to be offered a contract with considerably fewer SPAs than this, along with a verbal promise that the number of SPAs will be reviewed annually as part of the job planning process and will be increased if an increase is justified. It is argued that new consultants typically have less involvement in management and teaching than their more experienced colleagues. We regard this inappropriate for 4 reasons. Go and look at the document for the reasons. It is deeply inappropriate. Colleagues should not be agreeing to job plans in their department which do this. Colleagues should not be agreeing to their trust sending out contracts which are not the national norm. It also talked a bit about what happens if you've got problems with appraisal or validation if you're late. 2. If a consultant is employed with 2 or fewer SPAs, any problems with revalidation should lead to an urgent review of the SPA allocation. Quite agree with that. Here's a link to the document. QR code for a link to the document there. The other thing to think about in terms of SPAs is that all of this recommendation here from the Academy was before revalidation and appraisal had really taken off in the NHS. You can see it was 2010, that took off in 2012. And at the time, mandatory training was a fire lecture and CPR. We are in a totally different world now, totally different. And you could see that 2.5, or even the Welsh 3, is quite frankly probably not enough in the modern world. This is a section from the agreed national model contract, which dates right back to 2003, part of the agreement between NHS and the BMA, and really forms part of the contractual structure. This is what your contract should look like. I'm going to read through it. Check your contract, see if it does. If not, I suggest you start moaning. Anyway, this is what it should look like. The balance between direct clinical care and other programmed activities subject to the provisions for recognising emergency work arising from on-call rotas below. The schedule in your job plan will typically include an average of 7.5 programmed activities for direct clinical care duties and 2.5 programmed activities for supporting professional activities. Where your agreed level of duties in relation to supporting professional activities, additional responsibilities and other duties is significantly greater or lower than 2.5 programmed activities, there will be local agreement as to the appropriate balance between activities. It also says part-time consultants need to devote proportionately more of their time to supporting professional activities. This should be agreed on an individual basis. Refer to the guidance on part-time and flexible working for further information. Why was it 2.5 anyway? And why did it say typically? What was going on with that? Did it mean that when it says typically, actually, that just meant that a trust could say, well, actually, you can all just have 1 and count yourself lucky? No, it didn't. So the history behind the contract was when the contract was first offered out, there was the first offer said that if you were a consultant who'd been appointed for 5 years, you would have 3 SPAs because you'd be more involved in management, service development, and if you were less than that, you'd get 2. Obviously, when that went out, that caused a great deal of consternation. And then it came back, and the best language at the time was felt to be, if you said typically, it would allow some wiggle room above and below. Clearly, you might appoint somebody new who's really interested in service redevelopment, and somebody a bit further on in their career might have no interest in it at all and actually wish to concentrate more on straightforward clinical work. That compromise language, however, has been bent somewhat. In Wales, it's still 3 SPAs. And I think some arguments which you might use in your job planning, if your contract says you will typically have 2.5, some arguments you might say is, well, I'd like to be typical. Please make me typical. I want to just be a typical. Why am I atypical? I want to be typical. Let's agree some things that I'm going to do. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. It's both of your responsibilities really to find those SPA activities. It's really broad. You've seen the list before. Remember that SPAs also include time for networking with the broader MDT, networking with your colleagues. You are not just being a consultant when you are sat in a clinic. When you are talking to your colleagues, when you're talking to your nursing and other colleagues, and you're thinking about the way the service is working, that is all an important part of your work, and that should be fitting into SPAs. You haven't, because the way the contract's written, you have not got a contractual right to 2.5, but you absolutely have got a right to take this to mediation, take it to appeal and push it, and also flag it up with your LNC. Sort of thing that actually, as a department, as an LNC, it's also very amenable to local action as well. And that may well be the best way to do it. If lots of you are fed up about your SPAs, start organising, start to think about local action, talk to your LNC about it, get it changed. As I said, SPAs, because of that broad purpose of it, service redesign, networking with colleagues and things, they are really, really important. It's within this section that you're probably going to make the biggest difference. You're going to make more difference talking to the nurse specialists about what's going wrong in their service and how it interacts with your service and how you can both change it. Much more impact doing that than doing an extra clinic, because you may change something which is going to have a huge impact on the service for years ahead. Also, as I said at the beginning, this is the glue that's going to hold you together as a professional. The other categories we'll go through a bit more quickly. Additional NHS responsibilities, those are the sort of big jobs you're going to get in a trust: medical director, court guardian, or it may be a clinical governance lead, undergraduate dean, those sorts of things. The list is not exhaustive. Those are additional NHS responsibilities. External duties, examples of these, as you can see, work for Royal Colleges, being an examiner, that may fit within that. Specified work for the General Medical Council. External bodies, really, things that are going to benefit the NHS, sort of indirectly, but also directly. Not things, however, like I'm going to run the local cub camp. It needs to be things which are absolutely about the NHS in the wider sense. They do need to be agreed. These parts of your contract, you need to talk to your clinical lead and say, I intend to do this, I'm doing this, is that okay? And you need to agree a reasonable amount of time. That's a sort of flexible sort of thing. Again, that reasonable amount of time is appropriate for appeal and mediation and discussing again with the LNC if it's not going well. There is no sense in the contract that these other categories are in any way unpaid. Not in any way. They should be paid if they are a reasonable quantity of time. So it's not for the trust to say, well, you're doing it as a hobby. It's not a hobby. So that's an important thing to bear in mind. If you look at this QR code here, link to it later, then this will take you to a page on the BMA about this, and also a letter from the 4 CMOs of the UK nations saying how important it is for consultants to be engaged in work across the NHS for the good of the NHS. We are, after all, service leaders. A bit of a shout out for the kind of thing that I'm involved in. It's not good enough just to keep your head down. Honestly, we all need to be involved. If you've got a trust WhatsApp, join your trust WhatsApp. If you haven't got a trust all consultant WhatsApp, get one started after talking to the LNC. If you're interested in terms and conditions, if you're fed up about what's going on, if you're fed up about your SBAs or any of the rest of it, see whether there are enough people in the MSC. Definitely get involved. You should have something similar to a medical staffing committee. Make sure you go along, because the power of your local negotiating committee that does the discussion with your trust about the policies and sorts these things out, the power of that comes comes from the involvement of ordinary consultants in the medical staff committee. If you're in a trust of 1,000 people and 10 people go to the medical staff committee, your executives will think nobody gives a monkeys. And your LNC will be asked, where is your power coming from? You need to get involved. It's your responsibility. You cannot just berate others. And I'd really encourage people to do so. It's actually quite satisfying. What's the actual sitting down process of a job plan? So as I said, the job plan needs to be agreed between the consultant and clinical manager. That's what's written in the T's and C's. It's agreed in the meeting, a job planning meeting, between the consultant and the clinical manager. It's a prospective document. So it's not just about saying, well, I brought a diary and in your clinical lead saying, well, you didn't do that last year. It's about what you can do over the next year. The non-clinical manager can certainly set the scene, but there is no sense in the consultant contract that is a vital part of the process. And indeed, if you look at our recent survey of all consultants in England over job planning, only 35, about a third of people say they've never felt pressurised or intimidated in the job planning meeting. And we think a large part of that is the 2-to-1, having your clinical lead and the manager. You do not need to have them in there. Decline politely. Lots of trusts have now got multiple levels of sign-off. Again, there's nothing about that in the contract. That's something for the LNC, though I don't think you can change that as an individual consultant. LNC should be trying to unpick that, because all that happens is you've just got multiple levels of jeopardy. You have agreed your contract in your meeting with your clinical lead, and then suddenly you hear weeks later, oh no, Fred Bloggins, who's got nothing to do with your service, has decided there's a bit of an issue, it's been sent back. That really should not be happening. Another really vital thing to understand, and I left a dramatic pause there is no such thing as team job planning. I'm going to say it twice. There is no such thing as team job planning. It makes a lot of sense to sit down and look at your service and what's going on, what do we need to do, what do we need to deliver, to have a broad overview of it, very definitely. And part of that is looking at what did we do last year, what are we capable of doing, what resources have we got as a whole department, how many referrals are coming in. Absolutely. You'd be bonkers not to be looking at that. But that does not then correspond directly to some sort of team job plan. There is nothing like that in the contract, and there can't be, because your job plan is an individual agreement between you and your employer. You are the person that agrees. So bear that in mind. If you've got team job planning in your department, get that retitled and changed. Reset people's expectations. Team service planning. The next section is annualisation and pseudo-annualisation. I'm going to touch on annualisation first of all. So annualisation is, rather than having a standard job plan, you're going to agree to deliver, say you do a Monday morning, 42 Monday morning sessions over the course of a year. And then when you've completed those, say you get to September and actually you've already done all of your DCC sessions, when you add them up, they're all completed. You can stop in September because you have achieved your contract. That is annualisation. There is a new thing creeping in, which is not anywhere near so clever, which I shall show you shortly, called pseudo-annualisation. And I would suggest with that you give it a very wide berth. The difference between that and annualisation is pseudo-annualisation is you are being tempted to agree a minimum number of sessions as part of your objectives. And we'll come back to that in more detail. Some of the things that can be helpful in a job planning meeting is producing a diary. So if you've been doing a lot of work on as a particular element of service lead, and every year you have an argument where you say, well, look, I'm sure I do 6 hours, but you're only paying me for 2. Keep a diary, bring the diary, and then agree it prospectively. Units of time, you get a phone call. How long's a phone call? The original diary, which was agreed at the time of the contract by both sides, had a minimum unit of time of 30 minutes. Really important bit of this is objectives, and this is now even more important than it was, because pay progression is now a signed off process. before everybody just sort of fell through it. Now you need to be signed off. There's no difference anymore in terms of that you always had to have met your objectives to get pay progression, but I think we all need to start taking them a bit more seriously. They're often overlooked and they're just sort of signed off, and don't even look at them. It's just re-signed off. They've got to be reasonable. They've got to be agreed by both parties. And as you go through your career, your objectives are definitely going to change. They need to be around the SMART principles. It's important to note, as I say, that if you set some objectives and you don't meet them, then your pay progression can be withheld. So do not set yourself stretch objectives. This is not appraisal where you might set yourself something pretty difficult to attain for good reason. This is something you genuinely need to be able to manage. Coming back to pseudo-annualisation, if your job planning policy looks a bit like this, and it says that your objective is to deliver a minimum of 42 sessions per year for all of the sessions in your job plan, I would strongly urge you not to agree to that. Because all that will happen there is if you deliver 42, good. If you don't deliver 42, then you're going to be asked to pay them back, and I'll talk to you about that in a second. If you over-deliver, nothing whatsoever is going to happen. So you get the disadvantages of annualisation, but absolutely none of the benefits. Let me just talk you through an example as to why this isn't really a good idea. In a world where people's job plans truly reflected what they did, so you had a job plan where you had, you truly had 7.5 DCCs and 2.5 SPAs, and you were lead for, let's say, preoperative assessment, and that came with a realistic 1 PA for doing that a week, then it might be workable. But the real world is you'll probably find yourself on 1.5 SPAs, probably nothing for being preoperative assessment lead, and you will be put down for 8.5 DCC PAs a week. You will have all been in the experience where the vital meeting you need to go to, where they're about to destroy your service, is booked during the time when you are in a list. So you have to cancel your Monday morning list so that you can go to the session. Your job plan, however, is absolutely chock-a-block full of other sessions because you don't have realistic SPAs and you don't have realistic sessions for your job plan, for your preoperative assessment lead role. So therefore, you end up in a situation whereby how on earth are you going to pay that session back? You're going to end up paying it back in your own time, a Saturday, in an evening, or at your own expense. It's really hard to pay those sessions back. It works if you are somebody who literally does nothing else. If you just turn up and do the job, you can probably get away with it. But as soon as you've got some extra responsibilities, you're going to find that potentially you're going to struggle with those. If you're going to agree to annualisation, agree to proper annualisation. Don't agree to this pseudo-annualisation within your objectives. Another thing which I think is essential is the resources that a consultant needs. These are areas which are in your terms and conditions of service. The consultant and his or her clinical manager will also use job plan reviews to identify any potential organisation or systems barriers that may affect the consultant's ability to carry out the job plan commitments or to achieve agreed objectives. The job plan will set out agreed supporting resources, which may include facilities, administrative, clerical or secretarial support, office accommodation, IT resources, other forms of support, any action the consultant and or employing organisation agree to take to reduce or remove potential organisational system barriers. So make sure in your job plan, your part of your job plan is you have a secretary, you have an office, you have a laptop, you have IT that works, all those other things. In fact, it's potentially broader than that because that description is quite broad. So that may be access to wards, theatres, clinics, porters, preoperative assessment, private office space, etc., etc., etc. Those are part of your job plan. Once they're in your job plan, it's impossible for somebody to just remove your secretary because it's part of your job plan and therefore part of your contract. It needs your agreement the next year to make any changes. The next section is quite a detailed one. We're going to talk through some definitions, and this is about plain time, premium time, unpredictable on call, predictable on call. Let's go through those. Emergency work. First definition, predictable emergency work. This is emergency work that takes place at regular and predictable times, often as a consequence of a period of on-call, e.g. post-take ward rounds. This should be programmed into the working week as scheduled programmed activity. Now, just remember that bit about working week, because there's a really important definition that not many people are aware of coming up shortly as to what your working week is. Unpredictable emergency work arising from on-call duties. This is work done whilst on-call and associated directly with the consultant's on-call duties, except insofar as it takes place during time for scheduled programme activities, e.g. recall to hospital to operate on an emergency basis. And then there's a rider which just says that particular Schedule 3, Paragraph 6, non-emergency work should be regarded as including the regular programme work of consultants whose specialty by its nature involves dealing routine with emergency cases, e.g. A&E consultants. Okay, so Schedule 3, Paragraph 6, non-emergency work after 7 and before 7 a.m. during weekdays or at weekends will only be scheduled by mutual agreement between the consultant and his or her clinical manager. Consultants have the right to refuse non-emergency work at such times. Should they do so, there will be no detriment in relation to pay progression or any other matter. Now, in conjunction with that, further in the T's and C's, is Schedule 8, Paragraph 4, where unusually a consultant is asked to be resident at the hospital or other place of work during his or her on-call period. Appropriate arrangements may be agreed locally. A consultant will be resident during an on-call period by mutual agreement. So what that means is that actually those things which make you resident out of hours in premium time, so at the weekends, etc., so trauma lists, operating lists, premium time ward rounds, are actually something which theoretically at least you can refuse because they're excluded in your contract. Being resident on call isn't just when it says in your job plan, and this is a vital point to understand. Being resident on call is not just when it says in your in your job plan that you are resident on call. It's also if you are so busy that you cannot leave the building. So don't be saying to yourself, well, we're not going to put that down as resident on call. I don't want to be bound by that. You are by definition resident on call if you're so busy you can't go home. So if, for example, you're an anaesthetist and you start your emergency list at 9 in the morning on a Saturday and you're still there at 6 in the evening, whether it's because it says that in your job plan or you can't go home, you are resident on call. You have triggered that particular clause in your T's and C's. Or if you're expected to be in the building for any reason. Radiologists sat at home all day on the monitor looking at CTs. It doesn't matter if you're sat at home. If you're having to work all day, your home has now become your place of work. You are resident on call. On call is ad hoc work. Something happens, you drive in, you do it, you come back. Something happens, you're phoned up, you answer, you put the phone down. Not the way we're working currently. So you can't really be putting... let's go back to the definition for I think it helps. You can't be putting in predictable on-call sessions in premium time without the absolute agreement of the consultant. And what's important about that is that means that the time for on-call for premium time at 3 hours equals 1 PA is actually negotiable. You can do that by yourself, easier if you do it as a department, easier still if you involve the LNC. But it's up for negotiation because it's excluded in your contract. You might want to look at an enhanced amount, 2 hours as a PA. You might want to look at time off in lieu. You might want to think about what happens when you've been on call. Do you put in, rather than a day off or an SPA, do you put in a predictable on-call session then? If it's in the working week, that may make more sense. If you're doing extra contractual work of any sort, or you're doing additional PAs, so these additional PAs, it's worth giving some notice. And in that situation, the notice to give is probably to be professional and to fit with your contract 3 months. So you can just write and say, I'm not doing this anymore. It's extra contractual. Here's my 3 months notice. You're going to need to make alternative arrangements. Don't say I'm not coming in tomorrow. That's not a good way to go. And obviously it's better if you do it with colleagues. If you are doing some premium time, extra contractual work, and that's part of your 10 PAs, That work is still extra contractual. You're appointed as a full-time consultant. Really, the onus is on your employer to be making up additional sessions so that you can stay full-time, because you were appointed with a full-time contract, and sneaking some extra contractual stuff in there is not really good enough. So in general, the work's by agreement. Your LNC can set a minimum rate, and that's probably the best way to do it, and we can support your LNC in terms of this centrally. If you're on call and you're called in, that journey should be paid for in terms of time and mileage for every journey. If you're however driving in the working week to your place of work, that is not covered. Your trust should have a headquarters hospital. If you're driving additional distance to other sites, then again you should be paid in time and mileage for that. Let's pretend there's the ludicrous situation where you've agreed a job plan and actually you decide it's not working for you, or the other side. Either party can ask for a job plan review at any time. Again, it needs to be entered in the spirit of cooperation. And the procedure, if you can't agree your primary job plan or this job plan review, we shall cover. So it would be an incredible world where everybody agreed their job plan every time, although I think that has happened quite a lot so far. We don't have as many mediations and appeals as we need to, but it is to be expected, really, that not everyone's going to agree. The first stage of not agreeing is to ask for mediation. So either the consultant or the clinical manager can call for mediation, and both parties are going to need to state why there is a failure to agree. It needs to be done within 2 weeks of your job planning meeting. Don't leave it sitting for ages. And the medical director then has got 4 weeks to decide what they feel about it. Now, you can call me a cynic, but the medical director is often clearly going to find in their own favour. So that may not be the last you'll hear of it. If there's still no agreement, you need to go to a formal appeal. So you need to write to the CEO and the medical director, or any other instructions you've been given from the mediation outcome. Typically, the medical director will write back and say, if you wish to go to appeal, please email here. You need to do that within 2 weeks of the mediation outcome. There will be a panel organised. The chair will be nominated by your trust. You and your supporter, you need to be in a trade union. I really urge anybody listening to this who's not in the BMA to join the BMA. We will find a panel member to sit on the panel that actually understands about contract and job planning, and then there's a third person who will sit on the panel that comes from a central list. Some of the people on that are more managementy people, HR people, some are from the BMA, and there is the ability to challenge that third person if felt inappropriate. You cannot put people on it that have already been involved. That's the wrong thing to do. They're all supposed to be independent. When it comes to appeal, as I said, get advice, be in a union. It's not really a job for an amateur, and you cannot go to appeal and then join the trade union. You need to be in one already. If it's something to do with a specialty requirement, we can call for specialty experts to be involved. It's going to be done on Teams these days. Both sides are going to present evidence. Good idea if you bring a diary. Make sure you've got some really strong proposals about what it is that you feel is wrong and what you need to change. Consultants do well in it. And while the result isn't always binding on trusts, they do nearly always comply. And they actually probably live in terror of these things, because as soon as somebody goes to appeal and it gets carried, then that puts a lot of pressure on them for the remaining individuals. So we've actually come to the end. It's a bit quicker than I thought. What is job planning about? It's really important that both sides need to understand what's expected of them. I think the new element is that it is more likely that objectives and job planning will be looked at more closely with the new issues around pay progression, particularly in the years when you've got pay progression. It's important that you understand your contract so that you're not doing work which you're being inappropriately paid for, and to understand how you can make your job better and more sustainable. Important as well, so you can get those resources lined up so you can do the very best job for your patients and the local population. That is exactly the reason we're there. consider mediation and appeal. If everybody does it all in one go, there's going to be a bit of a delay, but I think that's worth putting up with. But also consider that there are lots of ways to fix these things in medicine. One is mediation and appeal. One is sort of recourse to law. But I think something which we need to get much better at is to understand the power of collective action. Just standing together, starting off with a survey or a petition, and standing together. We are a very, very, very powerful group. If the consultants aren't in the hospital, you've just turned the whole hospital into a nursing home. That is an incredibly, incredibly powerful position to be in, and we're just rubbish at understanding the power we have. Over the years, I think since 2003, a lot of stuff has happened, and I think probably you ask any LNC chair now, there have agreements been made in the past which we would wish hadn't been made, but they had. The way of unpicking that is us all standing together. The way of us improving job planning process, access to SPAs, all the rest of it is by us standing together essentially. So I don't think this is a job that we should be thinking that you can just leave to other people. Why won't somebody else sort it out for me? We are all part of this. So that would be what I'd recommend to you. Going to finish on what was one of the very first pages again. Just as a reminder, the last page here, look at your own consultant contract, dig it out, find the national template, see if it's changed, approach to LNC. There's some joint BMA and NHS employers website, guidance. We agree with a lot of it. Some of it we would probably resile from if we were asked to look at it again. A lot of stuff on the BMA website about this. You're going to need to look at your own policy as well if you don't like the look of it. Again, matter for the LNC. Don't forget to search for that consultant's charter on the website. I think you're going to find it really interesting, and hopefully it's going to be incredibly helpful around the country. We're now going to go, if you're in one of the live webinars, to the Q&A session. If, however, you have been watching this on YouTube separately, you're going to need to find us on Twitter, etc., or get in contact with your LNC for further information. Look on the BMA website. All the best, and hope to speak to you soon.